Picture this: center court at Wimbledon, July 4th, 2026. One of the most iconic arenas in the entire history of sport. The kind of place that has hosted legends, heartbreaks, and moments that get talked about for decades. And right there, in the middle of all of it, a 21-year-old from Quezon City in the Philippines drops to her knees and bursts into tears. The crowd absolutely loses it. Not the usual Wimbledon crowd, not the polite applause and the dignified golf claps that this tournament is famous for. Something completely different. Something this place has genuinely never seen before. Filipino flags everywhere, chanting that started somewhere in the stands and built into something that felt like it was shaking the seats. An entire diaspora screaming for one of their own on the most famous grass court in the world. And what had just happened to make this 21-year-old collapse on the ground in tears? She had just beaten the defending champion, the 6-time Grand Slam winner, the woman who won this exact title 12 months ago without dropping a single set in the final, winning it 6-0, 6-0 in one of the most dominant Grand Slam final performances anyone had seen in years. Alexandra Eala, world number 32, the first Filipino player in history to reach the second week of a Grand Slam, and the woman who just knocked Iga Świątek out of her own backyard. But here is the thing. If you only know the result and not the road that led to it, you are missing the entire story. Because this moment, this specific moment on this specific court was not an accident. It was not a lucky draw or a hot streak that came out of nowhere. It was the product of a journey that started not in some elite tennis academy with million-dollar facilities, but on club courts in Pasig City in the Philippines, guided by a grandfather who wasn't even a professional coach. A man who just loved the game, read every book about it he could find, and showed up every single day. That is where this story really begins. And once you understand where she came from, everything that happened on that center court makes complete and total sense. But that is only the beginning of what we need to unpack here. 4 years old. That is how old Alexandra Eala was when she first picked up a tennis racket. Not a junior racket either, reportedly one that was nearly as big as she was on the shell courts of Valle Verde Country Club in Pasig City. And the person handing it to her was not a coach, not a sports scientist, not a talent scout from some junior development program. It was her grandfather, Roberto Maniego, as Lolo Bob she called him, a club player. A man who loved the game the way some people love music, deeply and personally, even if they never played at the highest level. He coached swimming for Alex's mother, Riza, who was herself a competitive swimmer who competed at the 1985 Southeast Asian Games. He coached a few cousins here and there. He read books about tennis obsessively. And when young Alex showed up at the court for the first time, he decided to show her everything he knew. What started as a bonding exercise between a grandfather and his granddaughter turned into something neither of them could have fully imagined. He was not the kind of coach who broke things down into technical frameworks or video analysis sessions. He was the kind of coach who showed up every single day, who instilled a mindset before he instilled technique. "Alex, you need to be coachable," he would tell her. "Learn how to work with others. Keep your feet on the ground." Those were the lessons: discipline, humility, showing up even when it's hard. Alex has spoken about him in interviews with a warmth that tells you everything about what he meant to her. She has dedicated milestones to him from courts all over the world. And when you watch her play, the composure under pressure, the refusal to panic when a match turns against her, you can see the fingerprints of those early lessons in every single point. But there came a moment when the shell courts of Valle Verde couldn't contain what she was becoming. At 13 years old, Alexandra Eala left the Philippines. She packed up her life and moved to Mallorca, Spain, to train at the Rafael Nadal Academy, the same facility that had shaped one of the greatest players in the history of the sport. Think about what that means for a second. 13 years old, a different continent, a completely different culture. No established Filipino tennis legacy to follow, no roadmap from a player who had done this before her, because nobody from her country had ever done anything close to this before. Her mother, Riza, had been a Southeast Asian Games medalist. Her brother, Miko, would follow her into tennis. The family clearly understood sacrifice and the long game. But sending a 13-year-old across the world to chase a dream that had no guaranteed ending? That takes a specific kind of courage that goes beyond the athlete. It is a whole family deciding to believe in something before there is any proof it will work. And in Mallorca, surrounded by some of the best junior players in the world, trained by world-class coaches on the same courts where Nadal had built his own greatness, Eala started to become something different. Something that the tennis world was not yet ready for. By 2020, while the rest of the world was distracted by everything else going on, Eala had quietly climbed to the world #2 junior ranking. #2 in the entire world. And still, outside of the tight circle of people who follow junior tennis obsessively, almost nobody in the mainstream tennis conversation knew her name. That is the part of the story that tends to get glossed over when people talk about her now. There was a long stretch where she was extraordinary at a level that most casual fans simply do not watch. Junior tennis is its own world. The results matter enormously for a player's development, but they barely register for general audiences who are focused on the seniors making noise at the majors. Then came the 2022 US Open. The junior girls singles final at the US Open in New York. Eala walked onto the court and played the kind of match that justified everything. Every sacrifice, every early morning, every moment of homesickness in Mallorca, every book her grandfather had read about a sport he loved. She won. She became the first Filipino in history to win a junior Grand Slam singles title. And then she walked up to the microphone to address the crowd. She spoke in Tagalog. In the middle of Queens, New York, at one of the biggest junior tennis stages in the world, this 17-year-old looked out at the crowd and spoke in her native language. It was a statement of identity that had nothing to do with tennis and everything to do with who she was and where she came from. The video went viral almost immediately. She was 16 at the time. The speech technically came a year after the title, at 17. And within weeks of that US Open win, she was on the cover of Vogue Philippines. But here is where the story takes a turn that a lot of people conveniently skip when they tell the Eala origin story. Because the years that followed were not a seamless upward climb. They were a grind. 2023 and 2024 were spent almost entirely on the ITF circuit, the lower levels of professional women's tennis, the kind of tournaments that happen in small venues without much fanfare, where the prize money barely covers travel expenses, and the opponents range from established professionals to teenagers just starting out. This is where most promising junior players quietly disappear. The gap between being the best junior in the world and competing at the highest level professionally is enormous, and it has swallowed careers that looked infinitely more promising than Eala's. She was ranked outside the top 100, outside the top 200 at points. The tennis world that had briefly noticed her at the 2022 US Open had largely moved on to other stories. But she had not moved on. She was still there, still working, still showing up. And she was about to introduce herself to the entire sport in a way that nobody saw coming. March 2025, Miami Open. Alexandra Eala enters as a wildcard, ranked 140th in the world. Wildcard entries at WTA 1000 events are not supposed to do anything interesting. They're supposed to lose in the first or second round against players who have been on the tour for years, players with Grand Slam experience and rankings that reflect a sustained body of work at the highest level. That is what was supposed to happen. What actually happened was one of the most stunning tournament runs women's tennis had seen in years from a player nobody had ranked as a contender. First, she eliminated Jelena Ostapenko, a former French Open champion who has been a fixture on the tour for nearly a decade, a powerful ball striker who gives established top 20 players serious problems on a regular basis. Straight sets. Then, Madison Keys, number 5 in the world, a player who had won a Grand Slam, who had been in the top 10 for the better part of a decade. Also, straight sets. And then, Iga Świątek, number 2 in the world, multiple Roland Garros titles, the player who had been the dominant force in women's tennis for the better part of 3 years, the woman who, heading into that Miami quarterfinal, most tennis analysts genuinely believed was going to win the tournament. The score was 6-2, 7-5. And it was not an accident. Watch the footage from that match, and what you see is not a lucky player riding a hot streak and hoping for the best. What you see is a tactician. Eala stepped inside the baseline to return Świątek's second serve, aggressively, deliberately, and early, cutting off the angles that Świątek relies on to pull opponents out of position. She refused to get into extended exchanges that played into Świątek's strengths. She kept the rally short and the geometry of the court unpredictable. She made a player who had been dominating the sport feel uncomfortable for the better part of 2 hours. The tennis world genuinely did not know what to make of it. In the Philippines, the reaction was something else entirely. A country of 115 million people that had never produced a top 200 female tennis player suddenly had one, beating the number 2 seed at a WTA 1000 event. The social media numbers were staggering. The WTA later reported that coverage of Eala's matches was generating more engagement than content featuring Sabalenka, Gauff, or Świątek herself. For a sport that had been trying to grow its audience in Southeast Asia for years, this was an earthquake. She made the semifinals. She became the first Filipino to crack the WTA Top 100. She became the first from her country to reach a WTA 1000 semifinal. And she did all of it as a wild card who was not supposed to be there. Comparisons to Manny Pacquiao started circulating in the Filipino press. That is not a comparison that gets made lightly in a country where Pacquiao is essentially a national deity. But for a brief, extraordinary moment, it felt completely appropriate. However, and this is the part that matters for understanding what happened at Wimbledon, the story did not end there. Because 1 month after Miami, Iga Świątek had something to say about all of it. Madrid, April 2025. Clay courts. Świątek's territory, not Eala's. And Świątek made that very clear. The rematch on clay went 6-4, 4-6, 6-2 in favor of the Polish star, a result that showed she had done her homework for Miami. She had studied what Eala did, she had found the adjustments, and on a surface that heavily favored her heavier topspin game, she closed the door. It was a clinical win. It was also a message. One result does not define a rivalry. Then came Eastbourne in June 2025, a tournament that left a very different kind of mark on Eala. She reached the final, on grass, at a WTA 125 event, and then she lost to Maya Joint in a match that went to a deciding set tiebreak, where Joint won 10-12 after what had to have been one of the longest, most exhausting tiebreaks of Eala's career to that point. She has spoken publicly about how much that loss affected her, not just in the immediate aftermath, but for months. She said she couldn't bring herself to watch the highlights afterward, that the memory of it stuck with her in a way that most losses do not.
That is important context, because when a loss reaches you that deeply, it can go one of two ways. It can follow you onto future courts and sit in the back of your mind at the worst possible moments, or it can become fuel. It can become the thing you come back to when everything is hard and you need a reason to push through. For Eala, it became fuel, but that was not obvious in the months that followed. 2026 started with real promise. She was ranked 29 at one point, a career high, and the first Filipino ever inside the WTA Top 30. But the clay season was rough. She lost to Fernandez in Stuttgart. She fell to Ostapenko in Linz. There was a stretch where she was 0-11 against Czech opponents on the tour, a statistical quirk that sounds absurd but reflects just how competitive the tour is at the level she was playing at. None of this got much coverage. The narrative around Eala tends to focus on the peaks, because the peaks are extraordinary, but the truth is that in between the moments that make headlines, she was grinding through exactly the kind of difficult, inconsistent stretch that visits every player trying to establish themselves at the top of the sport. The matches that do not go your way, the losses that do not have clean explanations, the mornings after defeats where you have to make yourself believe it is worth getting back out there. She kept getting back out there. And then the grass season came, and something clicked. Because what happened next completely reframed everything that had come before it. Birmingham, June 2026, the Rothsay Classic, a WTA 250 event on grass that serves as one of the key warm-up tournaments for Wimbledon. Eala arrived there with a record of 3 top 10 wins on grass in 2026 alone, a stat that had started to turn heads among people who track these things closely. And she did not just perform well, she won the whole thing. Her first WTA Tour title, on grass, coming into Wimbledon. The timing of it could not have been more precise if she had scripted it herself. But it was what she wore to the court that told the real story about where her head was going into the grass season. A custom Nike visor with 4 words written in Tagalog, Kapag hindi naugua. The rough translation is, once it grows, it cannot be stopped. She explained to the press that she carries her culture onto the court intentionally, that every dream begins as a seed, and that phrase represents her journey, her country, the entire arc of what she is building. There was nothing performative about it. It wasn't a sponsor moment or a brand activation. It was a 21-year-old from Quezon City telling the tennis world exactly who she was and what she believed about herself, in the language of the people who had been cheering for her since she was a teenager. That kind of clarity, knowing who you are and carrying it publicly without apology, is not something a coach can install in a player. You either have it or you do not. And right now, Alexandra Eala has it in abundance. She arrived at Wimbledon 2026 having won Birmingham, having gone 3-0 against top 10 opponents on grass for the season, and carrying something that is harder to measure than rankings or statistics: genuine belief. Her first round was a comfortable straight sets win over Renata Zarazua, clean, efficient, no drama. Her second round was something else. Maya Joint, the same player who had beaten her in that devastating 10-12 tiebreak final at Eastbourne a year earlier, was waiting on the other side of the net. The tennis gods apparently have a specific sense of humor. Eala won the first set 3-6. Lost it, actually. Joint took it, dictated the pace, and for a moment the match had a very familiar shape to it, a shape that must have felt uncomfortable given what happened 12 months earlier. And then Eala reset. No panic, no forcing, no trying to do too much all at once. She simply tightened her decision-making, reduced her errors, and started dictating the geometry of the court rather than chasing joints. Second set, 6-2. Third set, 6-0.
A bagel against the player who had handed her one of the most painful losses of her career. On the same British grass where that loss happened, in a Wimbledon main draw. There is a word for that. Not luck, not coincidence. That is a player who took a painful memory, worked with it instead of against it, and converted it into something useful precisely when and where it mattered most. And after that match, Eala walked off the court knowing that the next name on the other side of the draw was Iga Świątek, the defending champion. Their third meeting, the first on grass. Nobody, and this is not an exaggeration, nobody in the tennis world was fully prepared for what was about to happen on center court. July 4th, 2026, center court, the most iconic tennis venue on the planet. Iga Świątek walks out first, as the higher seed, to the kind of reception Wimbledon gives its champions. Respectful,
warm, the applause of a crowd that knows what they are watching. She has been here before. She knows this stage. Then, Alex Eala walks out. The Filipino diaspora in the United Kingdom, which has been transforming Eala's matches throughout this tournament into something the All England club has simply never hosted before, erupts. Flags, chanting, noise that builds through each rally and peaks at the winning shot. Wimbledon's culture is quiet and measured, polite applause, the occasional gasp. This is something categorically different. And the match begins. The opening games are careful, both players holding serve comfortably, feeling each other out, neither willing to take an unnecessary risk. Then, Świątek draws first blood. A forehand pass right on the line, breaking for 2-1. The defending champion takes the early lead, and the crowd steadies. Eala breaks back immediately. Not through panic or recklessness, through tactical precision. She brings up break point with a high moonball return that pulls Świątek out of position, then nails an angled pass off the drive volley. It is exactly the kind of shot selection that won her the Miami match 16 months ago. She knows how to hurt this opponent, and she is not shy about it. Back on serve. Both players hold. And then, in the 8th game, Eala strikes again. Deep returns, aggressive baseline exchanges, forcing Świątek into an error. Another break. 5-3, and Eala is serving for the set. This is the moment where the match gets complicated. Świątek does not give up the set. She produces 3 consecutive forehand winners to break back and level at 5-5. The crowd that had been getting increasingly loud for Eala goes quiet for a beat. Momentum has shifted. Świątek squanders a break point for 6-5 with a missed return, and suddenly they're in a tiebreak with everything level and nothing guaranteed. The tiebreak that follows is the kind of tennis people will be pulling up on their phones for years. Eala builds a 5-2 lead, aggressive, clinical. She is returning everything and finding angles that Świątek simply cannot cover. And then Świątek finds something. 4 consecutive points. Suddenly, it's 6-5 in the tiebreak, with Świątek holding a set point. The entire stadium goes still. Eala saves it. Then another exchange, another grinding rally, 9-all. And then Świątek sends a forehand long, then another forehand error, 11-9 in the tiebreak. Eala takes the first set after 84 minutes of the most intense tennis either of them had played on grass. She falls to her knees. Center court becomes something it has never been before. The sound is not describable in terms that do it justice. You have to see the flags. You have to hear the chanting. You have to understand what it meant for the Filipino community in that stadium to watch one of their own, a girl who grew up training on a club court in Pasig City with her grandfather and a racket that was nearly as big as she was, take the first set from the defending Wimbledon champion on center court. But there was still a second set to play, and Eala played it like someone who was not ready to let the story end. She opens the second set with 2 immediate breaks of serve, sandwiched around a hold of her own. 3-0. The crowd is fully behind her. Świątek is visibly agitated, unraveling in ways that her usual composure would normally prevent. The double faults that had been a recurring problem throughout her 2026 season are showing up again. Her forehand, which needs to land deep to be effective, is sitting shorter than she needs it to. And against a player like Eala, who attacks anything that lands in the mid-court zone, shorter means opportunity. Świątek fights back to 4-2. She is never going to simply hand a match over. 6 Grand Slam titles do not arrive by accident, and the belief required to win them does not evaporate in one bad set. But Eala is not letting her in. 4-2 becomes 5-2, and then comes the final game. 6 deuces, 4 break points for Świątek that Eala saves one by one, each time returning to deuce, each time finding something under pressure that most players her age, most players at any age, would not be able to find. And then, on the match point, a left-handed forehand winner, clean, decisive, exactly the kind of shot that ends a match properly rather than waiting for the opponent to give it away. Alexandra Eala is on the floor again. The tears are back. The crowd is going nowhere. The scoreboard reads 7-6, 9, 6-2. 2 hours and 14 minutes of tennis that will be replayed and discussed and written about for as long as the sport exists. And somewhere in the stands, among the flags and the chanting and the noise that Wimbledon has never quite heard before, the legacy of a grandfather who showed up every single day with a book about tennis and a belief in his granddaughter is visible in every one of those tears. When the interview started after the match, Eala was still clearly overwhelmed. She stood on center court with a microphone in her face and said something that landed differently than most post-match quotes do. "I went to train with my brother and my grandfather every day after school with my ruffled socks, light-up shoes, and chubby cheeks. So to younger me, this is everything." That quote, right there, that is the whole story in 2 sentences. The ruffled socks, the light-up shoes, the chubby cheeks. She is not talking about the tactics or the tiebreak or the rankings or the history. She is talking to the version of herself that existed before any of this, before Mallorca, before the Nadal Academy, before Miami, before Wimbledon, and telling her that it was worth it, that showing up every single day was worth it.
Now look at what the result actually means, beyond the emotion. Alexandra Eala is the first Filipino in the Open era to reach the 4th round of Wimbledon, the first Filipino to reach the 2nd week of any Grand Slam. Her record against top 10 opponents now stands at 7-4. Against Świątek specifically, she is 2-1. And both of her wins have come at massive moments on massive stages. On grass in 2026, she is 3-0 against top 10 opponents. These are not flukes. This is a pattern. The Eala Tour, a phrase that ESPN coined earlier this year and that has since taken on its own life, is a real phenomenon. Wherever she plays, she brings fans who have never been to a tennis tournament before. The WTA has reported that content featuring Eala generates more engagement than content featuring Świątek, Sabalenka, or Goff. At the Australian Open earlier this year, her first-round match went viral, not because of the tennis, but because of the crowd. Overwhelmingly Filipino, overwhelmingly loud, in a tournament that had never seen anything like it before. She is doing something for tennis in Southeast Asia that no player has done before. She is making a sport feel personal to 115 million people who previously had no stake in it. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of shift in a sport's global reach that takes generations to build, and she is doing it at 21. And the story is not finished. Her next opponent is Jasmine Paolini, the Italian 13th seed, who was the 2024 Wimbledon finalist, a player who knows this tournament, who has been in the late rounds of a Grand Slam before, who will not be overwhelmed by the occasion the way a lower-ranked opponent might be. Eala beat Paolini once before, in Dubai in February, but a 3-set win in Dubai and a 4th-round match at Wimbledon are completely different situations. Nothing about what comes next is guaranteed. Nothing was guaranteed in Miami either, or at Eastbourne, or in the 2nd round against Joint, or in that tie-break against Świątek when it was 9-all and one forehand error could have ended the entire run. But here is what we know. Alexandra Eala does not run from the big moments. She runs toward them. She has beaten the #2 player in the world, beaten the defending champion of this tournament, done it on the sport's most iconic stage, in front of a crowd that was chanting her name in Tagalog at Wimbledon. And she did it with ruffled socks, light-up shoes, and chubby cheeks in her heart. A seed was planted in Valle Verde Country Club in Pasig City more than 17 years ago by a grandfather who just loved tennis and showed up every day. What grew from it cannot be stopped. Kapag hindi nausap. Think about that the next time someone tells you that a country with no tennis history cannot produce a champion. Because the history is being written right now, one tiebreak at a time.